In the process of doing grammatical research, there are three areas of grammatical research that are fundamental. Number one, the syntactical study. Number two, the lexical study. Number three, the morphological study. A syntactical study of a text is studying the sentence structure. The lexical study of the text is studying the words or the dictionary, studying the definition of words. The morphological discussion comes from the word morph, is the study of how words change. So the key words for syntax or syntactical is sentence structure. A lexical study is a word study, a dictionary, or a lexicon. A morphological study is the study of how words change. For instance, words change when we say run or running. I ran to the house. I am running to the house. Ran is past. I'm running is present. The word's changing there, and that's called a morphological change. So there are three areas that we study in grammatical research: syntactical, lexical, and morphological. When you're beginning to do a grammatical research and in a grammatical study, the first thing you want to do, the first step, is to make a syntactical structural analysis of the passage. A syntactical structural analysis is breaking down the sentence structure and finding out what's the main independent clause and what is the dependent or subordinating clauses. This helps you understand the passage better structurally and helps you understand what words to study and what the main ideas of the passage are. There's one fundamental concept that is important in the process of making a syntactical structural analysis. That concept is this: there are two parts of every sentence. Every sentence has two parts. Every complex sentence can be broken down into two parts. For instance, look at the example, the man ate the apple while he sat in the shade. That sentence has two parts to it. It has an independent clause, the man ate the apple, and it has a dependent clause, while he sat in the shade. The independent clause is the subject, verb, and direct object. That part of the sentence stands by itself. That's why it's called independent clause. It stands alone. This clause tells us what the main idea of the sentence is. Man ate the apple. That's the main idea. It's the subject, verb, direct object. You can have a complete sentence or a complete independent clause without the direct object. You can just have a subject and a verb, the man ate, and that could be your subject and verb. And that could be the entire independent clause, but it stands alone. The dependent clause, while he sat in the shade, is subordinating, hence dependent. It's actually modifying when the man ate. The man ate the apple when? While he sat in the shade. There are two types of dependent clauses. There is the dependent. There are two types of dependent clauses in phrases. There's a dependent clause and there's a dependent phrase. The dependent clause is called a clause because it has a subject and verb in it. Therefore, when we say while he sat, he is the subject and sat's the verb, but it's inside a clause, while he sat. And that clause is subordinating, modifying when the man ate the apple, while he sat. But the part of that sentence that says, the dependent clause that says in the shade, is a phrase. Now, the difference between a dependent clause and a dependent phrase is a dependent phrase doesn't have a subject and verb. In other words, in the shade is a phrase because it doesn't have a subject and verb inside of it. Conversely, while he sat is a clause, and while he sat in the shade is a clause, but the phrase in the shade is a phrase because it stands by itself. It's subordinating, telling you when he sat. So in the shade is an adverbial phrase subordinating to while he sat. While he sat is a subordinating clause which is telling when the man ate. So we have an independent clause, we have a dependent clause, and then we have a dependent phrase. The dependent clause is the man ate the apple. The independent clause is the man ate the apple. The dependent clause is while he sat in the shade, and the dependent phrase is in the shade. So in dependent clauses, you can have adverbial clauses or adjectival clauses. For instance, if I said the man who ate the apple, that's a clause, but it's adjectival. Or if I said the man of the house is a phrase telling who the man is. So it's an adjectival phrase. So in summary again, syntactically, sentences have two parts. They can have an independent clause and a dependent clause. The independent clause stands alone. The dependent clauses are subordinating. You can have dependent clauses or dependent phrases, and each one can be either adverbial or adjectival. Let's look at Romans 1:14 through 18 and do a structural analysis based on these verses. Paul says in Romans 1:14 through 18, I am a debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are in Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, if we break these verses down into a syntactical structural analysis, we find that there are two independent clauses in those verses of Romans 1:14 through 18. The first independent clause is Paul says, I am a debtor. That stands alone. Subject is I, am is a verb, a debtor. Paul is a debtor. Subject, verb, direct object. The other independent clause in the red there in the PowerPoint presentation is I am ready to preach the gospel to you. The subject is I, and Paul is ready to preach the gospel. The gospel is actually a direct object. To preach is an infinitive, and to you is a phrase. I'm not breaking this one down to the phrase level, just wanting you to see the main clauses. So we have two main ideas, subject and verbs that are independent. Paul is a debtor, I am a debtor, and number one, Paul is ready to preach the gospel, or I am ready to preach. Those are independent clauses. So when you do a structural analysis, you put the independent clauses in the far left margin, and anything that's dependent, you tab in to a subordinating margin. So for instance, Paul says, I am a debtor. There are four dependent phrases telling us where Paul is indebted. Those are all prepositional phrases. Paul says, I'm a debtor where? To the Greeks, to the barbarians, to the wise, and to the unwise. So there are four independent phrases. Those phrases do not have subject and verbs, therefore they're not clauses. So there are four independent phrases that modify Paul's a debtor. Now, when I look at the next independent clause, Paul says, I'm ready to preach the gospel. We have an independent clause modifying when he's ready or how he's ready. And above there we see, so as much as in me. So how is Paul ready to preach? Well, as much as is in him, he's ready. But then below that clause, below the independent clause, is another dependent clause that has a subject and verb. Paul says, I'm ready to preach to you, to who? An adjective clause modifying who? Those that are in Rome also. So see, that's an adjective clause modifying you. So we subordinated and indented in a margin. But there's another clause underneath that clause, a clause that tells us why Paul's ready to preach the gospel. That's adverbial because adverbs ask why, so therefore we have an adverb clause. Paul says, I'm ready to preach the gospel. Why? For I am not ashamed of the gospel. See, that's a subordinate adverb clause. It's dependent. But underneath that adverb clause is three other clauses that are telling why Paul's not ashamed. So Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Why? Paul says, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now there are many phrases in there. The power of God unto salvation is a phrase. To everyone that believeth is a phrase. To the Jew first is a phrase. Also to the Greek, those are phrases. And I'm not going to break those down, but those will be subordinated to this clause. But what I want you to really see is Paul says one reason why he's not ashamed of the gospel is because it's the power of God. Another reason Paul's not ashamed is in another subordinating clause or dependent clause. Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed. Another reason why Paul's not ashamed of the gospel, it reveals God's righteousness. From faith to faith is written, the just shall live by faith. But then there's a third reason that Paul's not ashamed. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. In other words, the third reason that Paul is not ashamed is it reveals God's wrath. The gospel reveals God's wrath. So what I want you to see in this brief structural analysis is Paul has explained why in these clauses. So if you were going to teach this, you would teach that Paul's ready to preach because he's not ashamed. And the reason he's not ashamed is three reasons. And what I want you to see is when you break it down structurally and do a structural syntactical analysis, you can easily see in the grammatical structure the main points and the reasons why. You can also see when you break it down in a syntactical analysis like this, you can also see how or where the important words are that you need to look up, and the clauses and the phrases that we need to see.